Shalom, welcome to Torah Talk with Tamar. I'm Tamar, and on this channel I discuss an ancient text with modern relevance. I'm Tamar, and today I want to talk about the topic of feminism, and to be more specific, biblical feminism. And I'll dive in later about the differences. So the question for today is feminism evil? There are a lot of people who push back against feminism and use it as a dirty F word, as if the people who are part of the movement are somehow doing the devil's work. But is this true when we look at the historical facts? What does the text of the Torah say about women's rights? And I'm going to assert the view that anybody who purports that the Torah or the Hebrew Bible is gender biased towards men and discriminates on women is acting from assumption and not an actual exegesis of the text, and they haven't done their proper research. So let's dive into this. I think in order to dive into a discussion like this, we first have to define what feminism is. And that word is so large that there could be a number of definitions just floating around. It means very different things to different people. And quite frankly, sometimes it's just thrown into conversation and maybe somebody hasn't really thought too deep about what it might mean. So I want to introduce the definition from ACPA, which is a professional organization for college personnel to pass on the information to their students and the academic community. They have a great definition, which I'm going to read verbatim from their information. Feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. So this is the definition given by the ACPA, and I think that's a very fair definition. It is, quite frankly, a pushback against sexism to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. And I want to talk more in this video about how that goal is completely in line with the Creator's will and with the Torah. So there are extremists within feminism who then flip that into misandry or hatred of men. And that clearly is not the goal of feminism, because when you turn it around and then are sexist against the other gender, you're again perpetuating the problem that feminism seeks to erase. So I'm going to discuss a middle ground here, a rational and reasonable understanding of feminism, not something extreme that goes to the other end and denies men equal rights and equality on the basis of their gender. So in feminism, there are three basic principles that the ACPA goes to outline, and I'm going to put the text up in the video, but reduce them to the core understanding of the principle. So the first principle is, one, that women have value to contribute to society. Principle number two is an acknowledgement that historically women have in fact been oppressed and not been able to reach their full potential because of that oppression. And I'm going to expand on that in this video to share those facts, because it is a fact that historically women have been more oppressed and been the recipient of more prejudice than any other group of people in history. And the third principle of feminism is that while critiquing what has happened in the past to women in an effort to turn the tide of history on that, feminists should not just critique, but they should also work for social change. So at some point, the discussion should produce results. So how do we tie this into the Torah? Because historically, it has been assumed that the Bible completely puts women in an inferior status. But is that true? So let's start in Genesis. And I want to start in Genesis 1:26, where we see that a reflection of the Creator is the Creator creating both genders in the image of the Almighty. And there is a word there that is Adam in Hebrew. That word is translated as humankind throughout the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. Translators have decided when they want to make that word mean man, mankind, or humankind. And this is where we start to get a problem in English. Because in the English language, to say man, we sometimes mean men and women. If we say mankind, we mean all of humanity, man and woman. And to clarify, in more modern English, we say humankind. So what translations have translated Adam to mean both genders? So let's get into that. I'm going to pull up my book here, which I'm going to share the title of later for you to explore it. I'm going to put the link to my book in the bottom links here, as well as some free resources about misogyny and how it relates to Torah. So in Genesis 1, it reads, "Let us make Adam in our image." Then Elohim blessed both the man and the woman, and Elohim blessed them and said, and I'll pause there. So this is Genesis 1:28 and starting at Genesis 1:26. The CJB translation that I read from translates Adam as humankind. Okay, and I'm going to read all the translations that translate Adam in Genesis 1:26 through 1:28 to mean inclusive of both genders. AMPC, CEB, CEV, ERV, EXB, GW, GNT, ICB, ISV, LEB, MSG, NOG, NABRE, NASB, NCV, NET, NIRV, NIV, NIVUK, NLT, NRSVA, NRSVACE, NRSVCE, NRSVUE, and voice translations. They all translated as humanity, humankind, human beings, and or mankind, which in English means both genders. So it's not just one translation that is saying this word ha'adam in Genesis 1 should be understood to mean both genders. The male and female that was created was a reflection of Elohim. Women were made in the image of Elohim as well as men. And that is attested to by the word ha'adam. Now, there are other translations that will say different. Okay, they don't want to acknowledge that women have attributes like the Creator. Now, why is this problematic? It's problematic because when they go to a later chapter in Genesis, during the flood account of Noah, they're translating the same word, ha'adam, to mean all of humanity was killed in the flood except Noah's family. So why, I will ask these translators, do they believe that ha'adam means both genders when we're holding both genders accountable for sin during the flood? But when we get the privilege of being made in the image of Elohim, suddenly ha'adam doesn't include women. So I'm going to side with the scholars that acknowledge that women were made in the image of their Creator. All throughout the Hebrew Bible, we see that the Creator has masculine and feminine elements. And most notably in the book of Proverbs, wisdom is called a female. She says that those who wish to preserve their life should listen to her wisdom. And we can see elements of women's emotions in the Creator as well, that the Almighty is merciful, tender, compassionate, and a builder of humanity, going back to Proverbs. So keeping in mind that the female gender was created in the image of Elohim as well equally, that is where we can later see in the Torah why the Torah gives women equal rights. And I'm going to dive in that some more too. There are people who have taken verses out of context throughout the Torah to say, look, this doesn't give women equal sexual rights. This gives all authority to the husband. But these people are cherry picking these verses and they aren't tying them together in harmony, going back with the idea that women were created in the image of Elohim as well. So I'm going to drop some links to my papers sharing how the Torah does not require a woman to marry a man that rapes her. There's no such concept in the Torah. And I want to drop the links because discussing these are each a video in their own. I could expand on those for hours, but today I want to focus on whether specifically the concept of feminism is contrary to the principles of Torah. And let's also talk about polygyny. There's a lot of people who believe that the Torah promotes sexual gender bias issues in the Torah. I'm going to drop a link to that. Polygyny is not permitted in the Torah. It has always been monogamy as a form of egalitarianism embedded in the Torah. I'll drop the paper for that. But look for a series that I'm going to be doing in the upcoming weeks about polygyny. I'm going to make that a 3-part video series for discussion and expansion. Let's go back to the core issue here. Is the idea of feminism opposed to the principles of Torah? No. Women were created equal in the garden from the beginning. Okay, and I already can hear the backlash. Genesis 3. What about Genesis 3 when it was pronounced that there would be a curse on Adam and Hava for their sin? We all know the story. They disobeyed. They were punished. What does it say in Genesis 3:16? Your desire shall be towards him, and he shall rule over you. Now, the Catholic Church has taken that verse and used it historically to oppress women without any regard to its context or the biblical Hebrew there. In Genesis 3:16, the punishment is given specifically singular you to Adam and specifically singular you to Hava. And here's the big elephant in the room that is often not discussed. And this is often pushed under the carpet because historically women could not read and most of the masses of men could not read either. But now we have literacy rates higher than ever in human history for women and for men as well. So in that verse, it's a curse. Genesis 3:16 was given as a curse upon Adam and Hava for not obeying. So why would we emulate a curse? It seems completely logical and reasonable that if we want to operate in the best scenario possible, we're going to not operate in the curse of Genesis 3:16. So then usually the argument for the continued use of the Torah to oppress women is, well, then why, if this isn't an inherited curse, do women receive pain in childbirth? This is where people's faulty research comes in, or their lack of research altogether. Genesis 3 does not say that a woman's punishment is pain in childbirth. Read closer. It says that increased pain in childbirth would be her punishment. And this is why we see that when women are in harmony with their Creator, they are promised a blessing of easier childbirth in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Let's go further. Adam was told he would till the garden in Genesis 2. There's a fly bothering me here. In Genesis 2, before anybody is recorded sinning, Adam was placed in the garden and told he would till the garden. That was not a punishment. He was created to have an enjoyable life growing what he wanted to grow. In Genesis 3, the curse is that the ground would be cursed. It would produce thorns and thistles. And that correlates to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where it says that the punishment for not obeying the Creator was a cursed ground. That men and women would not be able to grow crops because the ground would be cursed. So again, this is where people need to be looking in facts instead of oral tradition, because traditionally people have latched on to the Torah to try to oppress women without any regard to what the text actually says, without any regard to proper research and proper exegesis. And they could do this because the masses could not read. And people were brainwashed to just believe their religious leaders without reading the text themselves. Now, we have a copy of the text ourselves. We can read concordances. We can clearly see that the punishment given in Genesis 3 was a curse. It was not given to all women, and that the curse is reversed by obedience. So, then, can we say, after knowing these facts in Genesis 1 and 3, that the goals of feminism are contrary to the will of the Creator? No. A restoration of egalitarian principles between men and women is the Edenic ideal. The Edonic ideal, I guess, would be another way to say that. It's kind of a word that you read on paper a lot, and then you don't really transmit a lot. So we could say it either way, depending on transliteration. But the point is, the restoration of Eden is equality between both genders. And that is not contrary to Torah. And that is why I'm going to drop my links. I also want to share with you my book. But first I want to expand on which nations systematically and historically oppressed women. Oppression of women, sexism of women. What feminism tries to undo is sexism on 3 levels: individual, institutional, and social. Okay, because there's an argument made sometimes that, well, it was a wealthy group of men that oppressed most women. All men weren't in on this. But hold the brakes. That's not historically accurate, because religion has been used historically to oppress women on a social level and on an individual level within marriages. Men having attitudes that their wife's main existence is being their slipper fetcher or sandwich maker is a form of sexism on an individual level. And when women absorb those attitudes and believe from social programming, something we call internalized misogyny, they as individuals are allowing themselves to be discriminated upon. This is contrary to what women were created to be in the book of the Torah. In the book of the Torah, it says that woman was created to be etzer kenegdo. Now, this word in Hebrew has been butchered historically by English translations into helper, helpmeet, and something that people have reduced to mean domestic servant. Etzer kenegdo does not mean a servant of domestic labor to a husband. It has a powerful, powerful meaning. And within the links of the papers to my research, you will be able to dive in and see what etzer kenegdo means. And I keep trying to wait to the end to put a plug in for my book. But actually, I think this is a good time before I go into the historical fact that women have been oppressed throughout history. This is a book I've recently released, and if you're interested in gender equality as it relates to biblical texts, I encourage you to buy a copy of my book. It's available in paperback form on Amazon, and it's also available in a hard copy form for more of academic purposes. The title of this book is The Torah Made Her Equal. And in this book, I show unrefutable proof that the creator of the universe used the Torah to give women gender equality in society and in the home. And those who argue otherwise are people who have not actually read the text themselves. They're people who are operating on oral traditions. They are people who are relying on butchered English translations of a Hebrew text that say something completely different when we get into the Hebrew. Now, there's an accusation I want to address about feminism being the devil's work. Because oftentimes, people will latch on to the Torah, latch on to the Hebrew Bible, latch on to religions, and use that to try to further their misogyny without any regard to what the text actually says. It's like they already had this worldview that women are inferior, and then they run to a religious text and try to say, see, it's here. But the way that they're approaching the text is cherry picking. It's not understanding biblical Hebrew, and it's not using every single verse in harmony together from Genesis to the end of the Hebrew Bible. Because we cannot just pick a verse here and a verse here and a verse here, but it's like, what about the other 200 verses? To do proper exegesis, you have to lay all the verses out on the table. Account for textual variations, sure. Account for scribal variations and forgeries, yeah. Because the fact is, the Hebrew Bible has errors in it due to scribal forgeries and variations. There's scholars like Emmanuel Tove who have documented this. And that's a video for another day. But the point is, we cannot cherry pick verses like Genesis 3:16 and say, oh, look right here. It says that your desire shall be towards him and he shall rule over you. Well, what about the fact that that's a curse? What about the fact that in Eden we were made equal? What about the fact that Leviticus and Deuteronomy talks about removing curses? Who would want to live under a curse? We have to apply logic and reason to this. Now, let's look at the nations who have oppressed women. And this is our clue that feminism is not the devil's work. Let's go back to the beginning of time, and I'm going to name all of the empires that have lived and been created and then had their downfall because they did not give women equal rights under the law. Let's talk about Egypt. And I also want to expand on that later because there's a lot of revisionist history coming out lately trying to deny what Egypt actually did. So we got Egypt. We've got the Code of Hammurabi. We've got the Libet Ishtar documents. We've got the Ebla tablets. We've got the Byzantine Empire. We've got the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. And then I want to get into the United States. All of these nations, except one, the Persian Empire, which I want to deal with separately, all of those, Egypt, Ebla tablets, Code of Hammurabi, Libet Ishtar documents, Assyria, the Byzantine Empire, Greece, and Rome, they all discriminated on women in their laws. They controlled what women could wear, but they did not say anything about what men could wear. They had laws regulating women's sexual indiscretions or adulteries, but no such rule was given for men. They gave sexual inequalities in the law. Men could have multiple wives, but women could not have any kind of polyamorous situation. There were very harsh penalties for women, including throwing women into rivers for entering a tavern. Women could not own property if they were married. That's the irony of it. Once they married, their property was at the sole control of their husbands. There were inequities in politics. Women could not be in the political sphere. During the Roman times, when democracy became a new ideal, women were still not given a right to vote and participate in democracy. Now, a lot of people rebuttal, well, what about all the kings and queens and wives of pharaohs that were in there? They existed. They are considered women of power. However, these women existed in a harem for their husbands. Their job was pretty much to look attractive and bear children. And they were given money because of their looks. They were not necessarily included in political opinions or in fabricating laws. Another situation in which women were included in antiquity were in religious ceremonies. They were often included. But this is not necessarily a transfer of power. It's still a role of service. And we have revisionist historians now claiming that, well, wait a second, women in Egypt could hold land. If you actually look deeper into the facts, it was only 11% of women. And this was generally when women inherited property. there were laws to transfer property over to daughters in the absence of sons. But when there was a son, in these secular nations, the son controlled his sister's inheritance. Now, there were great inequalities in all these nations that were not Israelite nations. They were secular nations. So can we say that feminism is from a secular point of view? No. It was secular nations that oppressed women. And there is one exception in history that stands out, and that is the Persian Empire. Interestingly, the Persian Empire came from the descendants of Noah. And we have clues in Genesis that even though Noah lived before the covenant on Mount Sinai, he had laws about the Creator's will. Now, some people argue these are Noahide laws, and then other scholars argue that he had a copy of basic commands of the Most High. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but the point is we know that Noah had some laws. And then years and years later, his descendants in Persia are demonstrating an egalitarian society. In the Persian Empire, monogamy was considered the standard. Their religion, Zoroastrianism, a little bit difficult to pronounce, was a religion that shared elements with the Torah. And in that, they allowed women to be sages, writers, and judges. There were no requirements against what women could wear, and they were accepted into the public square for political opinion. The Persian Empire stands out as an empire that gave women gender equality. So this accusation that to be a feminist is incompatible with being a woman of faith is completely unfounded. It was the secular nations that opposed gender equality. Now, that started to change widespread when we had an enlightenment of the human mind in Europe. So this began the beginning of connecting ideas to the global civilization we see today through social media and through the global exchange of ideas that we have today. There is often an argument that feminism is a radical movement that started in the 1960s and 1970s, and that's not historically accurate. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a document that was widespread, a vindication of the rights of women. And in that document, she presented the idea that women were not mentally unstable and not mentally on the level of children, and that they should have equal rights in society and in marriage. And she was not the only writer at that time seeking to write and influence people to see women in a different light. This was considered a revolutionary idea since the Catholic and Protestant Church had historically oppressed women because of their Christian New Testament. That is a fact. There are writings in the Christian New Testament that speak of women being inferior to men and of challenging the idea that women are created equal. And I don't want to expand too much on the history of oppression in Christianity, but these voices that arose during the Enlightenment period, they were the first voices that used writing to transmit the idea that women were equals to men. Before that, women in Rome had a protest in 195 BC. But at that time, very few women had literacy rates or literacy at all to push forward their ideas. Okay, so it wasn't until Enlightenment that we start seeing widespread writing and gains in women writing. So around that time, so she's writing in Europe, but around that time in the colonies and the states, they are putting forward the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And at that time, a citizen who had rights was considered a white landowning male. Indentured servants who were white did not receive the same privileges of land-owning white males. Neither did anyone who was Melanesian, neither did a Native American, neither did black female and male slaves, and neither did white women. And this did not change until the 1800s. So I'm going to read down a timeline of women's historical struggle for equality in the United States. After 5,000 years of misogyny and women being systematically oppressed by institutions throughout empires, save Persia, we are now entering a phase in which men are trying to systematically gaslight women about the facts of their struggle to be treated as equals in society and in the home. And that's simply a lie. And whether or not their motive is to try to recycle women's struggle to forget what they used to not have. Because when you go to a young woman and you try to gaslight her about the facts of history, and she has no idea that women couldn't even do basic things like have a bank account without a man's permission, okay, she is susceptible to repeating history. Women need to be aware of the brutal conditions in which women lived in history. They lived under patriarchy. They were told that they were not worthy of monogamy, that they existed only for man's pleasure. That is an idea that goes back to Aristotle. He said that women were the material on which men acted. The concept that women sought pleasure in a marriage, whether emotionally or physically, was completely denied. Women were sold off like property because they were not given the humanization. They were dehumanized as humans. Okay, women didn't have literacy. They didn't even have the right to go to school. And then you have these men coming along saying that feminist is evil when all women have done is asked for the acknowledgement of basic rights like education, financial rights, legal rights, property rights, voting rights. What is so evil about that? And if they're going to default on the idea that the creator of the universe created women inferior, that argument is going to fail because that's simply not true. Women were created in Eden equal, and that is the ideal under which we are made to live. Just because a man latches on to the Bible or latches on to the Torah and starts spouting off all these misogynistic views in the name of the creator does not make it so. These hotheads, these men have not done their research. And women who play into this misogyny because they have codependency issues or their own internalized misogyny, who legitimately believe that they are better women because they're submissive and obedient women, are defying the facts. They have been conditioned and socially programmed for so long by the Catholic and Christian Church to believe that they are inferior to men. They have a right to believe what they want. But when their religion is pushed into the political sphere to deny women rights in banking, in voting, in representation, in property rights, that's where I draw the line and have an issue. Everybody has free agency to choose what religion they want. They're consenting adults. But when you try to push your religion onto other people who don't want to be part of your religion and try to deny them basic rights, as women everywhere around the world are still fighting for, that's when there is an issue. There are women rights advocates in the Middle East who are being electroshocked in jail for even mentioning the word equality. Is that the kind of world that you want to live in? Because when you pander to misogynists, do you really understand what you're saying? Are you ready to give up your bank accounts, your right to drive, your right to vote, your right to own property? What would you do if your husband died unexpectedly as a widow? Because the condition of widows throughout the world, because they have no rights, or they have very limited rights, is very problematic. It puts them in a very bad situation. And it recycles back to the patriarchy because then they have to latch on to men to survive financially through polygyny. Is that the world that women should live in? Or should they be free agents to decide from their own free will whether or not they want to enter a marriage because they want to be there? All the wealth of the women in Africa does not equal the wealth of 22 men. All of the women in Africa. And those who truly care about women are not feminists simply for one woman themselves or simply for the United States of America. We need to take into account to the fact that there are women all over the world suffering because they do not enjoy basic rights of literacy, finance rights, legal rights, rights in their home. They can't even run away from these situations. Currently, there is no refugee status for women in forced marriages, and that should change. And when we continue to allow misogynists to peddle their ideas on the internet, to affect the minds of men in countries who have access to the internet, but their wives don't, we are further oppressing those women. Okay, let's go back to what that struggle looked like for the women in the United States of America, because it looked different for Russia and New Zealand. And it even looked different in particular states. So I'm going to generalize where I can. And of course, if you want the history of each particular state, that's different. So in 1809, okay, the first woman's patent was given. Okay, in 1837, the first woman was admitted to college. 1837. Could you imagine being told, applying to a college because you want to be a lawyer or a doctor or a nurse or an accountant or an archaeologist or whatever you want it to be, because it's your right to dream and follow your career? Could you imagine being told that you cannot enter a college because you're a woman? What's wrong with entering a college because you're a woman? Are women not more than their sexuality? But, of course, misogynists will have you think otherwise. To a misogynist, a woman is the sum total parts of her sexuality only. But to an egalitarian, a woman is the sum total parts of her heart, her mind, her talents, her hobbies, her identity, her family, many things. But imagine, because when you pander to misogynists and you claim to be a traditional woman without regard to the fact that feminism is doing positive things for your own life, you're saying that you're okay with being told that you can't go to college on the basis of your gender. That is unreasonable. 1847. This is a big one. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in the United States. There were 12 resolutions given. 68 women signed it and 32 men, and that's important. They listed their grievances and they outlined a plan for women's rights. The most beautiful thing I found in the 12 resolutions was that they believed that their equality was given to them on the basis of the Creator's will.
Resolved that woman is man's equal, was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she should be recognized as such.
Inside the 12 resolutions, these men and women joined together to say that the Creator Almighty created women equal, and that was their right to be treated as equals.
Resolved, therefore, that being invested by the Creator with the same capabilities and the same consciousness of responsibility for their exercise, it is demonstrably the right and duty of woman, equally with man, to promote every righteous cause by every righteous means, and especially in regard to the great subjects of morals and religion. It is self-evidently her right to participate with her brother in teaching them, both in private and in public, by writing and by speaking, by any instrumentalities proper to be used, and in assemblies proper to be held, and this being a self-evident truth growing out of the divinely implanted principles of human nature, any custom or authority adverse to it, whether modern or weary, the hoary sanction of antiquity, is to be regarded as a self-evident falsehood and at war with mankind.
And I say it's particularly important that 32 men joined this convention to sign in the fight for women's equality, because it's men that created misogyny. It's a woman's struggle to say, no, I do not consent to be treated that way. But after all, it's men who invented misogyny. And if it's not men who are systematically trying to do this, we no longer have misogyny. 1862. Single women were told that they could own property. Ironically, married women were not given the same right. 1865. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton create the American Equal Rights Association for white and black men and women for universal suffrage. They joined together, just like in the time of Martin Luther King Jr., for an equal fight for equal rights for black males, black women, and white women as well. In 1868, that changed to become a suffrage movement for women only. Reason being is, in 1867, the 14th Amendment was created, and in 1869, the 15th Amendment, to free black male slaves, black female slaves, and to give black males the right to vote. So, black males were given the right to vote before black females and white females. And the movement was transformed to continue to be a movement for women only. And whether this was done to spite women, okay, because black males had previously been slaves and white women had been wives, but black males were given rights that their white women wives were not given. This might have been done out of spite for women, but it also might have been the deeply ingrained and entrenched Christian religion of the United States of America, which spilled over into politics. In 1871, Susan B. Anthony was arrested, tried, and convicted for registering to vote for Ulysses S. Grant. That was 1871. Okay, could you imagine being put into a jail cell because you simply want the right to vote? Because when women claim to be traditional women and they pander to misogynists, this is the world that they're asking to go back to. Okay, and I believe I have some leverage here to criticize this constructively, constructive criticism here, because I'm a widow and I am still a self-employed stay-at-home mom. When I was married, I did a traditional role of cooking, cleaning, homeschooling, taking care of the children. I also had a side business, which I still do, because women traditionally have had small businesses all throughout history. Okay, so their businesses worked alongside their homemaking choices, their homemaking responsibilities. This idea that women have to leave their child in childcare to work elsewhere is a different kind of aspect of feminism. But I believe you can still be a traditional woman and have a small business. But at the same time, even though I believe a family is greatly served by a woman doing the homeschooling and the cooking and the cleaning, I'm not going to go to the other extreme and say I should have no rights to vote, no rights to property, no rights to education. That's self-defeating. And putting myself in a codependent situation is not serving me. You know, I understand this even as a widow. My late husband died at a young age unexpectedly. So imagine if I didn't have the right to buy a car, to get a loan, to keep my house, to vote, to get an education, to have fair trade in the public square. I would have been in a very bad place as a widow. And I certainly don't believe a widow needs to be married to survive. That's institutional prostitution. I mean, it looks like you're being married, but it's just another form of prostitution. So I think we really need to appreciate the struggle that women went through alongside their male allies for equality. I mean, imagine if we couldn't read. I mean, what are we asking for here? In 1920, women received the right to vote. 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed in the United States to make it illegal to discriminate upon women in employment settings on the basis of gender. In 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed. 1974. That means about 50 years ago, women could not take out a line of credit without the permission of their husbands. Imagine being in a situation where you were being punched in your face repeatedly or beat daily by an alcoholic, but you can't even leave because you have no way to finance yourself. Okay, if you have to make it illegal for women to own property and money in order to keep her married to you, what does that say about the quality of marriage that men are offering? If you have to pin somebody in a cage to keep them from leaving, that's not happiness at all. If you give women the choice of whether or not they want to stay with you, predicated on your character, that is egalitarian. Now, in 1920, let's take a step back. Because in 1972, around the same time, we're talking 70s here, the Equality Act was reintroduced into houses of Congress and the Senate. Okay, that bill, that law was first proposed in 1923, and that was to add an amendment to the United States Constitution similar to the 14th and 15th Amendment, but more so the 15th, to not discriminate on people on the basis of their gender. Because in the late 1800s, we already had an amendment established not to discriminate on people on the basis of their race. And in the 70s, they brought up the Equality Act again because it didn't pass in 1923. They didn't have the requisite number of states required to pass that act. Okay? It wasn't until 2019, 2020 that Virginia became the 38th state required to pass that act. And yet, the Equality Act, to protect women against discrimination on the basis of their gender, has yet to be added to the United States Constitution because in 1972 they put a statute of limitations on how many states were required to sign by a certain date. So we have an amendment in our United States Constitution to protect people against racism. But we have failed as a country to pass an amendment to protect people from sexism. In both ways, sure. Protect men against sexism as well. But the historical fact is that misogyny has been the prevailing prejudice throughout all of human history. And if you want to challenge that or learn more about that, I encourage you to read a book by Jack Holland. It's called The World's Oldest Prejudice, Misogyny, The World's Oldest Prejudice. And in that book, he explores how women have been the most targeted group in all of history. People's lack of understanding about history, I don't know what's going on in schools these days, is why women are being gaslighted into believing they haven't historically been oppressed. And the red pill movement that we see arising today to try to squash and that movement of feminism and to try to confuse women and to try to gaslight people into the facts of history does not reflect the work of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched in the streets of Washington for the equality of Black women and white women as well. When he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, he mentioned women as well.
with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right now in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
This belief by Red Pillars that they are continuing on a worthy cause is not what Martin Luther King Jr. marched for. And when they try to appeal to religious texts, particularly the Torah, because I'm concerned with the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, if people have Islamic law that they want to choose as consenting adults to follow, that's their right. If they are choosing to be Christians, which has a prevailing doctrine of women's inferiority, that's their right. But when you go in a national and international atmosphere and you try to peddle your religious beliefs to oppress another population, that's when it's problematic. Now, you could argue, well, aren't you pushing your Torah ideas onto society because I have egalitarian views? We could argue that, but my egalitarian views aren't oppressing anybody. I'm not hurting men by saying women should have equal rights. So I encourage you to check out the links to my papers, which expand on specific topics in the Torah, like the right of monogamy as an egalitarian principle of Torah, that the sexual rights of women in the Torah were equal, and a paper I have, Gender Equality in the Torah. I encourage you to check out that link. But most of all, I encourage you to get a copy of my book, The Torah Made Her Equal. This is 20 years of research packed into a novel that is easy to read and informative. And this book is a step up from my public research that I've offered freely available to people because I care about the message of gender equality in the Torah. This is packed with more nuggets and more pages of things I have continued to learn even in the last 5 years. And now it's time to transmit that information to the world. I am so proud of this book, not in an arrogant way, but as a book of an encouragement to all biblical feminists and for women and men who are continuing the march against the tide that wants to oppress women around the world. We have the Creator's will in our heart and our mind. And for anybody to say that feminism is the work of the devil, they are completely off base. It has been secular nations historically that have oppressed women. To fight for the equality of women is to be in harmony with the will of the Creator, and that is when harmony and shalom is brought to the world. And I hope today that this message has been encouraging to you. Please remember the women around the world fighting for their equality, and please, those of you who continue to push back and expose the red pill movement, carry on. You're doing well. Shalom.